October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The stock market didn't just crash, it shattered a fundamental American belief that prosperity was permanent, that the future would always be brighter, that hard work guaranteed security. Within months, that shattering spread from Wall Street to Main Street, from businesses to families, from economic crisis to psychological transformation. The Great Depression didn't merely impoverish a generation financially, it rewired how Americans thought about money, work, security, and their place in society. People who lived through the Depression carried its psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They saved everything, wasted nothing, trusted no one with their money, feared unemployment with visceral terror. Their children inherited these anxieties, passing Depression-era psychology to grandchildren who never experienced hunger but somehow feared it anyway. The Depression created a distinct American personality, frugal, anxious, distrustful of institutions, obsessed with security. This psychological shift shaped national character for generations, influencing policies, parenting styles, financial behaviors, and cultural values long after prosperity returned. This is the story of how economic catastrophe became psychological transformation, how temporary hardship created permanent mental patterns, and how one decade's trauma echoed through a century.
Before the Depression, most Americans believed in upward mobility as natural law. Work hard, save money, buy property, build wealth. The formula seemed guaranteed. The 1920s reinforced this optimism. Stock markets soared, jobs multiplied, consumer goods flooded homes. The future looked boundless. Then it ended, overnight. Banks failed by the thousands, life savings vanished, stocks became worthless paper, jobs disappeared, businesses closed, farms foreclosed. Suddenly, the certainty that anchored American identity crumbled. John Steinbeck captured this psychological shock. The bank is something more than men, I tell you. It's the monster. Men made it, but they can't control it. Americans discovered that systems they trusted, banks, corporations, government, could fail catastrophically, taking their security with them. This realization created profound existential anxiety. If banks could fail, if jobs could vanish, if savings could evaporate, then nothing was truly safe. Security itself became an illusion. This psychological shift from confidence to perpetual anxiety defined Depression psychology. Middle-class families experienced the most jarring transformation. Working-class families knew poverty. Wealthy families had cushions. But middle-class Americans, teachers, shopkeepers, clerks, skilled workers, believed they'd escaped poverty permanently. The Depression proved them wrong brutally. Robert McElvain, historian of the Depression, described the psychological impact. The Depression destroyed not just the economy, but Americans' faith in the future. That faith never fully returned for those who lived through it. Shame accompanied financial failure. In a culture that equated wealth with moral worth, losing everything felt like personal failure, even when millions faced identical circumstances. Men who couldn't provide for families experienced crushing guilt. Women who couldn't stretch inadequate budgets felt they'd failed as homemakers. Suicide rates spiked. Between 1929 and 1933, suicides increased nearly 25%. These weren't just financial desperation, they were psychological collapse, the inability to process the destruction of everything one believed about how the world worked. Children absorbed this anxiety osmotically. They watched parents worry, fight about money, lose homes. They saw fathers broken by unemployment, mothers crying over empty cupboards. These childhood experiences imprinted fear that lasted lifetimes.
The Depression transformed American relationship with consumption and waste. Before 1929, the 1920s celebrated consumption. Buy new, discard old, embrace abundance. After 1929, waste became sin. Depression-era Americans saved everything because they'd learned nothing was guaranteed. Jars, string, paper bags, rubber bands, bread crusts, bacon grease, worn clothing, all had potential future value. Throwing away anything reusable felt morally wrong. This frugality wasn't temporary adjustment, it became permanent psychology. People who experienced the Depression never stopped saving margarine containers, reusing aluminum foil, washing and reusing plastic bags. 50 years later, elderly Americans who'd survived the Depression still hoarded supplies, unable to shake the fear of future scarcity. Studs Terkel interviewed Depression survivors in the 1970s. One woman described her mother. She saved everything. 30 years after the Depression ended, she still had a closet full of canned goods just in case. She'd buy sale items she didn't need because they might be unavailable someday. She died with a pantry that could feed a family for months. This behavior makes psychological sense. Having experienced total loss, Depression survivors tried controlling future uncertainty through stockpiling. If you have reserves, you're not as vulnerable. Hoarding became a coping mechanism for existential anxiety. Children raised during the Depression inherited this frugality even without experiencing deprivation firsthand. Baby boomers born in the 1940s and 50s grew up with parents who preached, "Waste not, want not." Clean your plate, children are starving. Turn off lights, electricity costs money. Fix what breaks, buying new is wasteful. This intergenerational transmission of Depression psychology shaped American culture long after the actual Depression ended. The greatest generation raised children who absorbed their anxieties, creating cultural patterns that persisted for decades. Food held special psychological significance. Having experienced hunger, Depression survivors could never be casual about food. They ate everything on their plates. They saved leftovers obsessively. They felt genuine distress watching food waste. For them, throwing away edible food wasn't just waste, it was moral failing. Clothing received similar reverence. During the Depression, families made do with minimal wardrobes, mending endlessly. This created lasting attitudes. Depression survivors wore clothes until they literally disintegrated. Buying new clothes felt extravagant, even when affordable. Shopping for anything non-essential triggered guilt. This frugality created paradox. As the economy recovered and incomes rose, Depression survivors could afford comfort but couldn't psychologically permit themselves to enjoy it. They'd been too deeply programmed with scarcity mindset.
The Depression fundamentally altered how Americans understood work and employment. Before 1929, Americans believed hard work guaranteed security. The Depression proved this wrong. Millions of desperate, willing workers couldn't find jobs. Unemployment reached 25% at its peak. 1 in 4 workers jobless through no fault of their own. This created new psychology around employment. Jobs became precious, precarious, never secure. Even after finding work, Depression survivors never felt safe. Layoffs could come anytime. Security was illusion. This anxiety never left them. Workers who lived through Depression unemployment developed almost pathological attachment to jobs once they found them. They arrived early, stayed late, never complained, accepted any conditions. Being fired became their worst nightmare because they remembered how unemployment felt. This generated submissive workplace culture. Workers tolerated abuse, exploitation, inadequate pay rather than risk unemployment. The fear of joblessness gave employers enormous power. Workers who'd stood in bread lines for years would accept almost anything to avoid returning there. Union movements paradoxically strengthened because of this fear. Workers recognized that individually they were powerless, but collectively they could demand protection. The Depression taught that capitalism without constraints could destroy lives. This realization drove support for labor organization and government regulation. Parents drilled work ethic into children with Depression-forged intensity. Get education, find steady job, never quit without another lined up. Loyalty to employers was virtue because jobs were miracles. This philosophy shaped career patterns for generations. Career stability became paramount value. Depression survivors and their children prioritized security over passion, staying in unsatisfying jobs for decades because at least it's steady work. The modern concept of job hopping or pursuing dreams seemed insane to people raised with Depression psychology. Government employment became gold standard. Post offices, schools, public services. These jobs offered ultimate security because government doesn't go bankrupt. Depression survivors steered children toward government careers obsessively. Entrepreneurship became suspect. Starting businesses meant risk, and Depression survivors hated risk. They'd seen businesses fail catastrophically. Safety meant employment, not ownership. This attitude suppressed entrepreneurial culture among Depression survivors' children. Women's relationship with work transformed uniquely. Before the Depression, middle-class women working outside homes was controversial. The Depression made women's employment economic necessity. Many became primary breadwinners when husbands couldn't find work. This experience created lasting changes. Women who'd supported families during the Depression never fully accepted traditional housewife roles afterward. They discovered capability and independence that couldn't be erased. This planted seeds for later feminist movements.
The Depression created distinctly paranoid relationship with money and financial institutions among those who lived through it. Bank failures in the early 1930s wiped out millions of savings accounts. People who'd saved carefully for years lost everything when their banks closed. This created permanent distrust of financial institutions. Depression survivors never fully trusted banks again. Even with FDIC insurance implemented in 1933, many kept cash hidden at home. Stories abound of elderly people dying and relatives discovering thousands of dollars stashed in mattresses, walls, or buried in yards. This cash hoarding made psychological sense. If banks could fail, if savings could vanish, then physical possession of money offered only true security. This thinking persisted long after banking systems stabilized. Credit became psychological anathema. Before the Depression, consumer credit was growing popular. After the crash, owing money felt dangerous. Depression survivors avoided debt obsessively. Buy nothing you can't pay cash for. Mortgages were barely acceptable. Other debt was moral failure. This anti-debt psychology shaped consumer culture for generations. Depression survivors' children absorbed the message that debt was dangerous, that owing money meant vulnerability. This created conservative financial culture that dominated until credit cards normalized debt decades later. Saving became compulsive behavior. Depression survivors saved obsessively, often beyond rational need. They'd learned savings were a crucial buffer against disaster. Even when comfortable, they couldn't stop saving because fear of future catastrophe never left them. Investment in stocks became psychologically impossible for many Depression survivors. They'd seen stock market destroy fortunes overnight. Putting money in stocks felt like gambling with disaster. This aversion to stock investment cost Depression survivors' families considerable wealth over subsequent decades. Real estate became preferred investment because it was tangible. You could see property, touch it, know it existed. It couldn't vanish like stocks or bank accounts. This preference shaped American investment patterns, contributing to post-war suburban expansion. Gold and other physical assets gained psychological appeal. Unlike paper money or stocks, precious metals had intrinsic value.
This thinking drove gold hoarding among depression survivors who wanted assets that couldn't be devalued. Insurance became sacred. Depression survivors bought insurance obsessively: life insurance, property insurance, any protection they could afford. Having lived through catastrophic loss, they desperately wanted safeguards against future disaster. Financial independence became ultimate goal. Depression survivors wanted enough saved to survive any crisis without depending on anyone. This drive for independence shaped their life choices, often at the cost of other values like family closeness or career satisfaction.
Perhaps the Depression's deepest psychological legacy was generalized anxiety that permeated survivors' lives long after prosperity returned. Depression survivors lived with constant low-level fear: fear of job loss, fear of economic collapse, fear of returning to poverty. This fear didn't subside when circumstances improved. It became permanent psychological condition. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton studied trauma survivors and identified the concept of survivor anxiety, chronic fear that disaster will return. Depression survivors exhibited this perfectly. No amount of later prosperity could erase memory of losing everything. This anxiety manifested in countless behaviors: extreme risk aversion, inability to relax and enjoy comfort, constant preparation for disaster, difficulty trusting good times would last. These weren't conscious choices, they were automatic psychological responses programmed by trauma. Children of depression survivors inherited this anxiety secondhand. They absorbed parents' fears, learning to see the world as a dangerous place where security was temporary. This created anxious parenting style that affected baby boomers and subsequent generations. The phrase, "wait for the other shoe to drop," captured depression psychology perfectly. Good times couldn't be trusted. Disaster lurked around every corner. This pessimistic worldview shaped national character. Planning obsessively became a coping mechanism. If you plan for every contingency, maybe you can prevent disaster. Depression survivors made lists, created contingency plans, prepared for worst-case scenarios constantly. This gave illusion of control over uncontrollable forces. Trusting institutions became nearly impossible. Banks, government, corporations, employers all had failed depression survivors. This created cynical attitude toward authority that persisted for lifetimes. They'd learned institutions protected themselves, not individuals. Social comparison anxiety intensified. Depression survivors constantly measured their status against others, terrified of falling behind economically. Keeping up appearances became important because visible poverty meant vulnerability. This created social pressure that stressed families. Health anxiety increased. Depression survivors who'd gone without medical care developed legitimate fears about health. They also learned that illness could destroy families financially. This created an anxious relationship with health and healthcare that affected medical decision-making.
The Depression fundamentally restructured American family life and relationships, creating patterns that lasted generations. Traditional gender roles destabilized. When fathers couldn't find work but mothers could, family hierarchies inverted. This created psychological stress, but also opened possibilities for different family structures. Men experienced devastating psychological damage from unemployment. In a culture that defined masculinity through providing, jobless men felt they'd failed fundamental duty. Many became depressed, withdrawn, sometimes violent. Their inability to fulfill provider role crushed self-worth. Some families never recovered from this psychological damage. Fathers who experienced long-term unemployment during the Depression never fully regained family authority, even after finding work. The reversal of roles created permanent shifts in family power dynamics. Women gained new roles out of necessity. They became breadwinners, decision-makers, family stabilizers. For many women, this was empowering despite hardship. They discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. However, this empowerment came at a cost. Women carried double burden:
earning income while maintaining household duties. This exhaustion was physical and psychological. Many Depression-era women aged prematurely from relentless stress. Children grew up fast during the Depression. They worked to supplement family income. They understood adult worries too young. They witnessed parental stress and absorbed it. This created prematurely mature children who carried psychological burdens inappropriately young. Family size decisions changed dramatically. Birth rates dropped significantly during the Depression. Families couldn't afford additional children. This created smaller family sizes that became normalized, contributing to demographic shifts. Extended family became a crucial support network. When nuclear families couldn't survive alone, they moved in with relatives. Multiple generations shared cramped spaces, pooling resources. This created complex family dynamics, but also strengthened kinship bonds. However, these living arrangements created stress. Grown children living with parents felt they'd failed at independence. Multiple families sharing resources created conflict over decisions and resources. Privacy disappeared. Divorce rates actually decreased during the Depression, not from increased happiness, but from inability to afford separation. Couples stayed in unhappy marriages because living apart was economically impossible. This created strained relationships maintained only by financial necessity. Children witnessed marital stress intensely. They heard fights about money. They sensed parental anxiety. They internalized relationship patterns based on crisis management rather than healthy connection. This affected their own future relationships. The Depression taught families that material security mattered more than emotional fulfillment. This created a pragmatic approach to family life. Decisions were based on financial considerations rather than emotional ones. This pragmatism shaped parenting for generations.
The Depression didn't just change individual psychology, it transformed Americans' relationship with government and political beliefs. Before 1929, most Americans believed in minimal government interference. The Depression shattered this belief. When private sector failed catastrophically, people turned to government as last resort. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs created new expectation. Government had responsibility to protect citizens from economic disaster. Social Security, unemployment insurance, bank regulations, these established principle that government should provide safety net. This shift wasn't universally accepted. It created political divide that persists today. Some Americans concluded government intervention was a necessary evil. Others saw it as dangerous socialism. These competing interpretations of Depression lessons shape political debates decades later. Depression survivors generally supported strong government programs. They'd lived through market failure and private charities' inadequacy. They wanted systemic protections against future catastrophe. This created voting patterns favoring expanded social programs. Their children inherited varying lessons. Some absorbed parents' belief that government protection was essential. Others reacted against it, embracing individualism and market solutions. These divided reactions contributed to America's persistent political polarization. Trust in capitalism itself was shaken. The Depression proved market forces alone didn't guarantee prosperity or distribute resources fairly. This created openness to alternative economic models, though outright socialism never gained majority support. Collective action gained legitimacy. Labor unions, community organizations, mutual aid societies, these grew from Depression experience. People learned that individually they were vulnerable, but collectively they had power.
The Great Depression lasted roughly a decade. Its psychological impact lasted lifetimes. People who experienced the Depression carried its marks until death. They saved obsessively, feared waste, distrusted banks, clung to jobs desperately, lived with constant anxiety about future catastrophe. These weren't choices. They were psychological programming created by trauma. The Great Depression didn't just change America economically, It changed Americans psychologically, creating mental patterns that defined national character for generations and still whisper in our collective unconscious today.